This is our concluding lecture on the topic of full and empty speech, and what we're going to focus on today is 5 crucial, characterizing, definitive features of full speech. Last time we ended by considering some of Richard Nixon's words when he did what seems almost like a by mistake stumbling onto a near, maybe not quite confession, but an example where his words seem to go ahead of him, ahead of where his ego intended. What we'd like to do now is just to try and use that extract as a way of highlighting a series of features of full speech. Before we do that, one quick thought, a question. Why would Nixon even allow himself to be in that position? Or maybe put it differently, what was the particular factor which meant that he shifted? You could say that the whole series of interviews for Nixon was very much about fortifying a given image, of trying to protect his legacy. So why allow one to be in a position, or how are we to account for the fact that he makes these admissions? What does he say? These are so many legalisms. As far as the handling of this matter was concerned, it was botched up. I made so many bad judgments. Why would he even allow himself to say that? Now, I think the commonplace psychological type of explanation would be to say something like, oh, he had a bad conscience about it, he needed to come clean, and this was his chance. And he didn't necessarily prepare to do that, although some people of a more cynical disposition might say that he, in fact, wanted to or needed to. Some might say, well, I had this unconscious urge to. I think a Lacanian way of approaching the issue would take a different tack, and not to focus on the psychological intentions, the psychological intentionalities of it. And by the end of our 5 different facets of full speech, I'll return to that. Because from a Lacanian perspective, maybe the crucial factor here was not simply that, at some unconscious level he wanted to confess. Maybe. This is psychoanalysis after all, so you can make reference to some kind of unconscious. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be interesting to think about a certain shift that occurs, a certain symbolic shift when David Frost moves essentially from being an imaginary counterpart, an ego, interviewing one ego. Essentially, you could argue in Lacanian terms, a kind of mirror image that Nixon is enacting aggressive, antagonistic relationship to in fact rather doing and adopting another role by asking, how do you feel about the American people? Of course, my argument would be that it's at that moment, how do you feel about the American people? Let's dramatize a little bit. At that moment, Frost is no longer simply the little other. He's essentially embodying or bringing about something of the dimension of the big other. How do you feel about the American people? There's the cameras, the lights, the weight of history, the fact that he suddenly asks, what do you feel about the American people as such? That to me seems to momentarily evoke something of the dimension of the big other. And I think that moment of being misfooted, of things shifting so that Nixon is confronting the question of what the American people might think, that I think is a kind of more Lacanian response to why he ends up making the admissions that he does. Nevertheless, let's have a look then, and this is just my kind of schematic overview of 5 dimensions of full speech. The first, I think, is now we're going to try and get a sense of how we know this is full speech, or what full speech might entail. The first is one that I've already mentioned a couple of times, and that is the idea, and here we're still in good Freudian terrain, right? It's almost like we're in the terrain of the surprised, the unexpected element that in speaking, I've ended up saying more than I thought I would. And I've tried to describe that. This is my first aspect of full speech, that Nixon ends up speaking beyond himself. He's surprised. There's something other in his speech. In a way, he is caught unawares by the implications of what he's starting to say, right? So this, in a way, it sounds a little bit like that moment, the surprising moment of the Freudian slip. Now, it doesn't seem that Nixon makes a slip, but it does sound like he is surprised by where his speech has taken him. In other words, it kind of rattles his ego, and it opens up into a trajectory that he hadn't potentially thought about where he might end up. The second facet, I think, rather than simply that of speaking beyond oneself, of surprise, is the idea, closely linked to it, that what has happened there is that it's no longer simply an ego-to-ego moment of speech. An ego-to-ego moment of speech is a more comforting mode whereby I'm able to project an image of my subjectivity that I like, an idealizing image. Keep on using that reference of an ideal ego image. Rather than that terrain, it feels like suddenly it's no longer simply, and only momentarily, it's no longer simply an ego to an ego, but it's an ego before something far more destabilizing. It's an ego to the other. Not just an ego to ego moment of speech, but speech as it happens before the other. And in previous talks, I've tried to stress that if we want to get a sense of what that might feel like, think about yourself in front of a famous person or a court of law, where live speech is at its most precarious, where somehow the stakes of how one is presenting oneself are increased, whereby there is a presence of the beyond, of some important otherness there. Incidentally, this helps us make a nice distinction. We could pose a question, particularly if we're trying to think about this dimension of the other. What are the necessary conditions to make a confession? And we could say, well, let's have a bunch of ideas. I could confess something simply to myself. But then that doesn't really sound like a confession. I mean, maybe there's an awareness, I've made a realization to myself, a kind of ego speaking to itself. It doesn't really sound like a confession. We may give a second answer. The second answer, maybe I confess something to a friend. Yeah, okay, but in a way, a friend, imaginary counterpart, that sounds just like a slightly extended version of admitting something to myself. But yes, okay, we could say that's a kind of intersubjective type of confession. But surely the idea, how we often understand confession, is that confession necessarily involves the big other being present, in the sense of an authority, some kind of truth-bearing and often powerful authority. I confess to a priest. I confess to an officer of the court. Those kinds of confessions seem to have a different weight. Anyways, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's just trying to underline how the concept of the other, I think, is a useful way of getting a sense of, is that actually a confession or not? The other seems to bring about, to embody some kind of authority, some kind of objective authority and truth, and becomes a basis. That particular speech context becomes a basis for something that we would consider an adequate confession. The third facet that I'd like to emphasize here is the idea of the performative dimension. Now, there's a lot of material in communications theory where people talk about speech acts. Speech acts aren't just describing the world. Speech acts aren't just a true or false description of the world. Speech acts are acts. They're declarative. They are an act of speaking that changes the world by virtue of it having been spoken. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this material, you'll be all too well aware of the many examples. I now pronounce you man and wife. I christen this ship the great Queen Elizabeth. These are acts, once performed under the right circumstances, don't just describe the world, they change something. They have a kind of symbolic registration. They change the recognition of how things have happened. So Lacan is not often understood or spoken about in relationship to speech act theory, but when he is speaking about full speech, he is interested in how a moment of full speech, we could call Nixon's quasi-confession a moment of full speech precisely because it has that performative dimension. Here's a short, a brief kind of mini quote out of Lacan's Seminar 1, when he says, "Full speech is speech which aims at, which forms the truth, such as it becomes established in the recognition of one person by another. Full speech is speech which performs." That's the point that I want. Full speech is speech which performs. Now, of course, you may have various different definitions of that, but I think there's a nice moment when Nixon says, yep, I let the American people down, and I have to carry that burden with me for the rest of my life. And here it comes. My political life is over. That is a performative statement. He's no longer simply musing or wondering. To say my political life is over in the recorded situation of a historical set of films, interviews that will be televised, is to not simply describe a possibility, it's to now declare my political life is over. So in that respect, when something is done in speech and is declared and spoken in a way before the big other, it is a speech act, it's declarative, and it has an impact on the subjectivity of the person. This is important for Lacan because one of the conclusions we will draw from all of this is that Lacan's hopes for change within a psychoanalytic clinical encounter is not about how the ego is going to try and change itself. That kind of voluntarism of egoic agency is not for him what will enable meaningful, significant, if we can even call it that, change in the treatment. That's not an adequate level of change, which is also why for him a whole regime of insights and insight-based learning and new CBT kind of understandings and trainings, they won't bring about fundamental change. For Lacan, change needs to happen via the symbolic. And that's, I think, why he's so interested in this performative dimension. Because by something being declared, by the performance of speech, it's almost as if the shift to the subject already happens at the level of the symbolic, and they are then only later catching up to that shift. So one can imagine that after the day's interview, Nixon goes, oh gosh, did I say that? Or even if he doesn't, some of his aides, you just said your political life is over. To reiterate the point, for Lacan, that's how change happens. It happens by something being registered in the symbolic, not because of like, ooh, my own subjective, egoic, psychological attempts at change. You are changed by virtue of what you said. And in fact, that makes for a nice way of thinking about the potentiality, the prospects of what full speech can do. You are changed by virtue of what you said. Not that I intended to say something, and this is what I said, and these are implications of it. Rather, by entering into speech, by entering into a speech encounter, by entering into a subjective praxis of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, I open up the possibility that something that I will say in that domain will change me. Let's quickly look at number 4 and number 5. You can see in some ways these sometimes seem to blur a little bit into one another. The fourth element that I've emphasized here is the idea that the subject's relationship to truth has changed. And I think that follows on fairly nicely from the point that I was just making. The subject's relationship to truth has changed. The subject's relationship to truth has changed. That's a nice way of putting it, because it's no longer simply what I want to believe about myself, but by having spoken, by having said certain things in a certain situation, that means my relationship to an event has, by definition, changed. You could see that, I think, nicely in what Nixon is saying. And one has almost a sense in his words that, okay, now my political life is over. Now how I will think about and how I will be related to the concept of the American people has also definitively shifted. So if we want to think the fourth idea here is a new relationship of truth, or a new relationship to truth, we would also once again want to emphasize that this is a type of speech which is not an ego-comforting, imaginary type of speech. Rather, it's the exact opposite. It's a coming undone of the ego, or a coming undone of some of the previous images that the ego used to understand itself. So in a way, that's a kind of efficient and kind of elegant way of thinking about what full speech does. It's a coming undone of versions of the ego. And in that respect, you could say, almost by definition, it's going to be anxious speech, maybe even painful speech, because the ego doesn't like giving up on its idealized, ideal images of itself. A fifth dimension, and here we start to round up. A fifth dimension is what Lacan goes on to talk about as founding speech. Founding speech suggests that not only has the subject shifted, or the ego of the subject been somehow challenged and come undone by virtue of what is being said, Founding speech wants to suggest that a whole series of relationships that the subject has to key people in the world, to others, and in a way the big other, are also now shifted. So you could say that by virtue, I think in a very real, important way, Nixon's relationship to the big other of the American people fundamentally shifts by virtue of what he says in that interview. You could also say that his relationships to the people around him, even indeed to David Frost, also undergo that shift. So one important element here, I think, just to bear in mind, is that Lacan is inspired by structuralism. He's inspired by the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and one of the elements that comes out from that is this idea that any everyday exchange between people is not just a dialogue or an exchange. It often invokes or involves implicit promises, implicit contracts. Yes, I promise to do that. Or in the famous sense that Lacan sometimes cites, I call someone, you are my wife, as a way of reiterating the fact that I am their husband. In other words, you could say that there's a kind of upkeep, a kind of symbolic role reciprocation, whereby to speak, to interact in certain positions is to substantiate the symbolic, to relocate my role in the symbolic, and also implicitly to kind of take on the contract of, by calling you my wife, I'm also taking on a role of the husband. And I need to, in some respect, respect part of what that contractual element might be, contractual in inverted commas. So that's a kind of long-winded way of suggesting that when we're in the domain of the big other, all sorts of speech interaction are implicitly binding us to certain social roles, certain, and again, I keep on using this, contractual or legalistic dimensions. Now, I'm kind of exaggerating the language there just to make this point, but the idea here is that by speaking, by engaging, by being able to say something, I am constantly doing upkeep on the relationship of myself to other people that I am speaking to institutions, to my social role. And thus, if full speech is going to enable a kind of transformative shift, it's not just going to affect the ego, it's going to necessarily entail a series of different relationships to those key people around one. And I think this is what's being noted in this idea of a new order of relationships, both with the little others around me and the big other. So in conclusion, we've done a lot of stuff. We've tried to get a sense of what, for Lacan, are the pitfalls, the shortcomings of imaginary speech and what he wants to call empty speech. We've taken a little bit of an inspiration, moment of inspiration from Heidegger. We've tried to think about what Heidegger makes as the difference between Gerede and Rede. And we've tried to see, although they don't match up, how some of those ideas have kind of captured Lacan's interest and how he's tried to formulate a distinction between empty and full speech. Part of the importance of doing that is to sensitize us to what might be crucial elements of transformative potential within a psychotherapeutic domain. We'll return to some of these ideas as we start to explore in a little bit more detail some of the Lacanian understandings of the unconscious. And so I think we'll leave that for today with the one exception, your homework exercise. There were at least 4 slips or errors in my speech in the last 25 minutes. I'm pretty sure of at least 3 of them, but your homework exercise is to note them and to say, what are the potential implications of the mistakes he made? He made a little mistake, he said a word that wasn't quite appropriate. What other possible reading, what implication might be put in play by virtue of the mistakes, the disturbances, the little could we dare we say it, the possibility of a little full speech interruption in the words he was using?